Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Good afternoon. My name is Moses. Welcome back to the Truth in My Days Apologetics Program. Today, we have Johnny speaking with John regarding strategies to address alleged errors in the Bible. Yesterday, we looked at 3 rules. Rule number 0, which is to say, if anyone makes a claim, never accept it on its face value. Always ask for evidence. Rule number 1 was to give the Bible the benefit of the doubt. As we have shown in previous programs, the Bible is the Word of God and have given convincing reasons to believe so. As a result, before accepting an error on its face, looking for an explanation would be a great start. The second rule was to actually understand what an error is. An error, as we said, was an unsolvable problem, not just a discrepancy, unless of course it is irreconcilable. By way of illustration, we went through an apparent contradiction in the 1960s Batman TV series and showed that it was in fact not so. Today, we continue the program and the examples.
Let me give you another example of that. The series of the century, the hockey series that all Canadians know about, the Summit Series from 1972 between Canada and the Soviet Union. It came down. 8 full games came down to the very last minute. Series tied 3 games each with one tie. And the last game is tied 5-5 with less than a minute to play. And then, of course, we got that very famous goal by Paul Henderson, set up by Phil Esposito to win the series for Canada. And there's a problem here. Esposito and Henderson didn't normally play together. Henderson was normally on a line with Bobby Clark and Ron Ellis. Esposito was on a line with Peter Mahovlich and Ivan Cormier. So how did Esposito and Henderson end up on the ice at the same time? Well, if you ask Paul Henderson, he tells this story that he was on the bench, his last minute, and he suddenly felt this overwhelming conviction that he was going to score a goal. And so he called Peter Mahovlich over to the bench. Mahovlich came off, Henderson went on. And that's why he was on the ice in the last minute to score the goal. But if you read the book written by the coach of the series, he said that he didn't want to give up a goal in the last minute. He wanted the Henderson line on the ice. So he called the Esposito line off the ice, but Esposito himself wouldn't come off. And that's why Henderson and Esposito were on the ice at the same time. Now, again, these two seem utterly irreconcilable. How could they both be true? Could they both be true? What do you think, Johnny?
That does sound contradictory.
Could it be that Henderson is telling the truth? He called Mahovlich off. Meanwhile, the coach is trying to take that line off at the same time. Henderson didn't hear the coach. Coach didn't hear Henderson. So each of them are maneuvering to have Henderson on the ice. Neither knows the other is doing it. So each of them is telling the truth. Is that possible?
Yeah.
There you go. Another seemingly irreconcilable problem that is actually reconcilable. And in fact, history is replete with them. Rasputin was instrumental in the final days of the Russian Empire and the fall that led to the communist takeover. Listen to these 2 statements. Tell me if they are compatible or contradictory. Statement number 1, Rasputin was killed by assassins who poisoned him. Statement number 2, Rasputin was killed by assassins who shot him. Now that certainly sounds contradictory, doesn't it?
It does seem contradictory, especially if it happened at the same time.
They both happened. Okay? And the thing is, you have to read carefully. He was killed by the assassins. They did poison him. That was plan A. They invited him to dinner. They laced his food with poison. He ate it, but he didn't die. He tried to leave. They pulled out guns, shot him. He still didn't die. They pursued him to a little bridge over a river. They shot him again. He fell over the railing and was never seen again. It would be irreconcilable if it said Rasputin was killed by assassins who killed him by poison and who killed him by shooting him. But as it is, actually not, because the assassins did poison him and the assassins did shoot him, and he was killed by these assassins who did both of those acts.
You point out another interesting thing is how one reads the language, because I think there's some nuance there. as you pointed out, is indeed the assassins, they both poisoned him and shot him.
So both statements are true. And that brings up a point that we'll probably talk about later, but is worth mentioning. Sometimes the exact wording is crucial. And this is why sometimes a careless translation can end up introducing an error that's not there in the original. Let me give you one more example here. And this one, again, would sound very, very contradictory. Statement number one, Daniel Boone was famous for exploring the western part of the state of Virginia where he built Boonesborough. Statement number two, Daniel Boone was famous for exploring Kentucky where he built Boonesborough. Here it has the place name, and we can't argue it's two different places because in both places he built Boonesborough. How could you possibly reconcile these two?
Could there have been two Boonesborough, one in Virginia and one in Kentucky?
That could be a possibility, that he built two, but he didn't, in fact. There was only one.
That gets interesting.
Well, it's actually soluble if you know the history. At the time Daniel Boone was exploring, there was no state of Kentucky. He was exploring the state of Virginia. The western part of it was known as Kentucky, a Mohawk word for among the meadows. And it was later that Kentucky became a separate state. Okay? So when he was exploring it, Kentucky was a part of the state of Virginia. It was the western part of the state of Virginia. So this illustrates another fact, that sometimes you have to know the history. Something that looks like an error on the surface really isn't once you know the actual historical facts.
Oh, I definitely didn't know that one. I guess you both needed to know U.S. history and how its geography changed during the time.
Yes, and that's why we apologists have to do some serious digging sometimes. You can't just accept the claim of a contradiction and we look at it and say, yeah, it looks contradictory, so we have to accept it's a contradiction. Look hard enough, I don't think you're going to find any in the Bible. But let's continue with our principles. Okay? Principle number 3. And I mentioned this before, I touched on it. Be aware that there are errors in some of our modern English Bibles. There are genuine errors there, but they're not there in the original. They've been introduced in part, sometimes bad translations, but sometimes because the translators are using inadequate texts of the original. They're using bad Greek manuscripts. And unfortunately, now we'll talk about this at length on another day, but unfortunately, the people who are responsible for compiling our Greek texts from which we translate have bought into a lot of ideas, a lot of liberal principles, and end up championing bad texts with errors in them. For example, if you have your NIV or your ESV or your NASB, and you look up Mark chapter 1, verses 2 to 3, and you'll read this, "It is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him." Now, this is actually an error because the first part of that quote, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, is actually not written in Isaiah the prophet anywhere. It is actually Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. So this seems to be a flat out error. The Bible is telling us that this sentence is written in Isaiah the prophet, and it is not. And here's where you look at those apologists who've come to accept that these bad Greek texts are good Greek texts, trying to explain these away. And we see some very bad apologetics around this, and sometimes downright embarrassing. One apologist writes this: "This passage about Mark 1, 2 to 4 illustrate the same point about Jewish copying conventions, which are not errors, even though they may not comport to the Chicago Manual of Style." And another one writes, "Is this an error? By no means. The Jews often kept all the prophets on a single scroll and would often cite the most prominent of the prophets. There is no error in following the citation conventions of the day rather than 21st century practices as various biblioskeptics unreasonably demand." What do you think of that, Johnny?
I think I would ask, Are there examples of this happening?
Which would be a good question. Anything else?
Seems to be a strange practice.
It does indeed, and because there was no such practice. Let's first clarify that there was no such practice. I've read this in so many apologetics books, and you check, okay, what is your source for this? And they will footnote another book. And you go to that other book, and they will make the same claim, and you look at what's their source, they footnote yet another book. The other book makes the same claim without offering evidence, but cites yet another book. And you go down this lengthy trail trying to find some objective evidence somewhere that there was such a copying convention. And finally, you get to one that offers one source, a book called A Student's Guide Through the Talmud by Z.H. Chages. Well, I happen to have that book. I looked it up. It says no such thing. So somewhere along the line, some apologist trying to get around this problem convinced himself it must be that way. And this is not the way to do apologetics, folks. By picking the bad Greek text, they have put in an error and then they make up stuff to try to get around. It's not the way to do good apologetics. There's a lot of other problems here. The second apologist says the Jews often kept all the prophets on a single scroll. That's not true. The scrolls just weren't big enough. If you're familiar with the famous Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, one scroll holding the entire book of Isaiah, that's about as big as a scroll could get. You couldn't put Malachi and Isaiah onto the same scroll. You wouldn't. Malachi would go onto another scroll, what we call the minor prophets, because those were all short. You could fit them all into one scroll. But Isaiah would have its own scroll. Jeremiah would have its own scroll. Ezekiel would have its own scroll, and so on. So this claim isn't even true. But the real error here is to say that if people made mistakes in those days, it's okay for us to make the mistakes. That's not a mistake. Of course, it's still a mistake. Truth hasn't changed its definition. Whether you're in 1st century AD or 21st century. This is not a citation convention. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. To say that this sentence is written in Isaiah the prophet when it isn't is an error. And there's no way around that. To say, well, that's the Jewish copying convention of the day was to make this error, so it's not an error when everybody else is making the error. That's essentially what they're saying. And that makes no sense. It would be like everybody in your class, or almost everybody in your class, writing down 2 + 2 = 5, and then arguing with the teacher, well, this is not an error because everybody's doing it, so it's just a convention. That's just silly. What do you think, Johnny?
You're correct. Truth should be true. It doesn't matter. Where we are, and certainly it would be incorrect if the writer of the Bible did attribute a particular quotation to the prophet who did not write it.
Exactly. So how do we get around this error? Well, to recognize it's actually not an error. If you'll read, say, New King James Version, for example, you'll read this. As it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And that's actually correct. You have quotes from 2 separate prophets, and Mark says, as it is written in the prophets. No problem. And that is the reading, folks, that's found in almost every single Greek manuscript, with the exception of a very small handful of corrupt manuscripts that for some reason our scholars have decided are the best. So do understand, there are some errors you will find in your NASB, ESV, NIV, and so on that have been introduced because they're using the wrong Greek text. And as I said, we'll do much more on this some other time. But let's continue on these rules.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.